Welcome to Hellenic Voice, the podcast that celebrates Greek culture. In each episode, we explore literature, poetry, archaeology, theatre, the Greek language, and the connections of Hellenism with other cultures, as well as with the Philhellenes around the world. Welcome to Hellenic Voice. I'm Vasula Christodoulou, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Victoria Hislop, the internationally acclaimed author of The Island and The Figurine. Her novels bring Greek history to life with unforgettable characters and captivating stories. Victoria, it's wonderful to have you on the podcast. And to start, what does Greek culture mean to you, and why do you think it holds significance on a global level?
Wow, that's a big question to begin with, Vasula. Why does Greek culture matter on a global level? Well, on the strictly European level, in Greece is the cradle of culture. It established visually our aesthetics of beauty, what we consider beautiful, of philosophy, of literature, of poetry, and of course politically of the whole notion of democracy. So the really important things of life, I think many of them were born within that relatively small country that we call Greece today. And I think many people would argue that the Greeks of today are not the Greeks of the ancient times that, developed and created those things. But I have personally, I can't see the join between the people I thank for those cultural gifts and the Greeks of today. I don't care that there's a gap in the middle.
Oh, thank you so much. Very nice answer, I must admit, and thank you for that. Now, speaking of Greece, your novels often weave together history and personal stories, especially connected to Greece and Cyprus. What first drew you so strongly to these places? Apart from what you just told us, many reasons,
Yes, I
but
mean, I think I still, although I have my Greek identity and my Greek passport, I can speak, I think, pretty conclusively of the sort of British mentality and how the Brits see things. And I think many of us feel a certain connection either with France or Italy or Spain or Greece in terms of where we love to spend our holidays. And for me, it was always Greece. I felt a very special love and connection with it. From the late 70s, after my first visit, I made sure to go to Greece every single year. And that's really 50 years now. So very
50
often
years.
when I meet young Greeks and they ask me anything, and I can safely say to them, well, I've known Greece for longer than you have. I might not know
Exactly.
it in the same depth, but I've seen transition and change and development in Greece in a way that anybody under 50 won't have seen. But in terms of my interest as a writer, it's really simply this, that for let's say the first 20 years of going as a tourist and loving all the things that tourists love, the weather, the food, people, to some extent the ancient sites, because that's what you do when you're an educated Brit. That's your in a way, your entertainment is to go and marvel at all the, the signs of this great civilization from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and it's completely unlike anything that we have in Britain. We were still, gosh, living in, and I'm not exaggerating, we were living in sort of wooden huts and caves, and um, we were pretty primitive when the Parthenon was being built. It would have been, if you beamed a British person into Athens at that period, they would have thought they'd gone to another planet. There was literally nothing of any really civilized, what we now think of as civilized nature going on in Britain at all until the Romans came. That's suddenly when we had straight roads, we had mosaic flooring, the underfloor heating, all of that. Before the Romans, we were really quite a primitive culture. So, and obviously they were post the ancient Greeks. So for Brits to see what was happening, 2, 3, 4,000 years ago is an extraordinary intellectually discovery. And all of that was fascinating, but it was only when I started to read about 20th century history of Greece, which isn't something that people generally know very much about at all. Probably an educated person from the UK, they might know that the Ottomans occupied for nearly 500 years. They might, but they might well not. And they don't know what that has meant, in the sort of longer term. And they certainly wouldn't know what Greece went through in the 20th century, how tough it was. They see the superficial. That's what tourism generally is. It's an escape from your own kind of humdrum experience or your life to go and have a lovely time somewhere else. I would say that defines the mentality of standard tourist. So the tough part of 20th century Greek history is not something most people would be interested in. But I began to read.
Yes. And yes, you've actually addressed or you dealt, with some very challenging chapters of Greek history, as you said, such as the Civil War, the occupation, on which even historians often have different views. How did you first start engaging with these difficult or deep subjects?
Well, always the first part of any research journey is reading. And of course, that's where you find that historians have different views always. They're not, we've all got used to the idea from Trump that truth is a bit of a sort of flexible concept, even if clearly that's wrong. That the truth, there is always a truth, but you can have round the edges, you have opinions. And so I read, books by much more left-wing historians and by more right-wing. So, you have to build up your own perspective. And as a novelist, what I do is I'm usually speaking through my characters. So the characters are people who hold opinions, which makes it very different from writing, let's say, a non-fiction academic book, because then most historians want you to follow the view that they've taken. Whereas with fiction, you can be, I suppose, more subjective, if you see, if you like. I mean, that's the word. A character is always going to be wanting them to be like a human being who reacts to a situation depending on what part of it they've seen. So I suppose an example of this is the one of the protagonists in Those Who Are Loved, which has some Civil War content, where the young woman is caught up and ends up fighting for the communists in the Civil War. Because of the circumstances, she gets sort of swept into it, and only retrospectively is she very regretful, not only what she's seen, but what she's had to do, which as a young woman, the things that, you'd hope you never would have to do. But, she's been obliged to kill or be killed. And she's not proud of that. That haunts her for the rest of her life. So as a novelist, you can put your characters into a situation to show perhaps the ambiguities. You don't make someone who's killed another human being a hero. You just show how that was a situation that she had to react quickly. So as well as reading, obviously, that's the main thing, I always find extremely helpful photographic evidence. I mean, just because it's always much more interesting, I think, to give examples. I remember seeing a photograph. Again, this was to do with the occupation, and it was after the massacre in Distamo, when the Germans were on their way out of Greece, but still committing some pretty terrible crimes. And they killed men, women, children, and the animals of that village, as a sort of revenge action as they were leaving. And they almost, as a sort of trophy, they took pictures of each other, against this backdrop, as a kind of to show to somebody else that they'd taken part in this as a matter of pride. So when you see that, you think, well, I didn't make up that the Germans behaved, in a brutal way. That in a photograph, it's not faked, it's not photoshopped, it's an actual photograph from that period. So photographs are very useful because these are from a time when, and if they've been in an archive, nobody's kind of added two bits of an old photograph together to make a new one. It just, that didn't happen. These are real evidence. Speaking to people, obviously. I mean, I don't use real people's stories. I've always avoided that because their story is their story. But if an elderly gentleman I met a few years ago, I don't think he's still with us, he'd spent many, many months on Macronissos as a detainee. And I think you feel in your soul whether you believe what somebody tells you. You can see from the look in their eyes.
Exactly.
And children of people who were on other islands. So yeah, it's people, it's photographs, it's to some extent an instinct, it's reading, it's traveling, it's looking in. For me, one of the best places is it's called ASCII, which is the Archive of Socialist History. It's quite near the centre of Athens, and they, for example, have some original pieces of paper that were the pieces of paper signed by those who did a confession, a δήλωση, and they are very very moving, kind of, in a way, fake statements, because they were written by people who, in return for their freedom, had to write almost like an essay about how regretful they were about their past views and actions, and they renounced their beliefs in communism, etc., etc. And they're written, the ones that they showed me were written on very fine paper, very, very almost like airmail paper, which is what they would have had in the 1940s, and written clearly with a blunt pencil. They are authentic and very moving. And I remember when, all the books writing about that period talk about these confession statements. And I remember when the professor, I think it was Kostis Karpouzilos, he got this out of a file to show me, and I found it really intensely moving to see an actual piece of paper with someone's painstaking writing, in pencil. Somehow the whole thing just really profoundly moved me. And I thought, this is real. This is a real human being has created this sheet.
Yeah.
So there you are. There's
Oh,
a
thank
long
you.
answer.
No, this is a nice clarification. It's so important because I have to say many people do ask, but how did she knew it was the right source? But I mean, now I can understand, and thank you so much for
Yeah.
that.
And
And
I
now,
do, before I write, I'm reading
mhm,
or researching, going into museums. That's usually 3 years of time. So I'm very, I love doing it. I find it
yes, yes,
fascinating. So I'm
yes,
there all the time. Oh, I
it
just have one more
shows.
tiny thing that, let me just add one thing that I did last week. It's always nice to have a really fresh thing. And these things always excite me.
Mhm.
Um, I wanted to be really clear about what happened with the currency during the period of occupation and then into the Civil War in the whole 40s. And in fact, it started with, I went into a flea market in Athens, and I found there was a woman selling some old drachma notes, and I bought one that was for 2,000 billion drachmas. So it's two with, what's that, 12 noughts. So this was the inflation. And to me, that's terrifying that the week before, maybe 1,000 or a few thousand
Yes,
drachmas, and suddenly they had to print them with 2,000 billion, which I guess is a trillion, I don't know. But that was fascinating. And in the museum, the Numismatic Museum in Athens, they explained a lot to me and also showed me the currencies that have been printed. These were either a German currency or
mhm,
an Italian, depending who your occupiers were. So again, the idea that Greeks in occupied Greece would be the currency they would have to use would be a kind of Deutschmark if they had the Germans, or an Italian currency. And there were these notes that were made for them to use. I think, okay, being occupied is bad, but suddenly you've got this money that is not you wouldn't
yes,
feel that was your currency. You have been thoroughly taken over. I mean, and that I didn't
yes.
know until I went into this museum, and I thought, wow, so many details.
Right, we can. I have to say that we can see your passion, that you really love what you are doing. But looking at your novels, specifically your internationally acclaimed novel, The Island, touch readers all over the world. How did the true story behind it inspire your writing?
The Island, to some extent, is an exception, um, different from my other novels in that it was my first. And at the time, I didn't speak even a word of Greek. It was like Kalimera or Kalimari, depending if I said Kalimera, Kalimari, I'd be in a restaurant and I'd have a lovely plate of calamari presented to me. So when we went to Spinalonga just for a, 3-hour visit, one afternoon, and I felt very moved. That was a very sort of visceral rather than an intellectual reaction. We go across to this tiny island, which where people with leprosy had effectively been imprisoned because, I knew that they were isolated there, some of them for decades. Um, I just felt I wanted to write about their lives or what I imagined their lives were. So it was very much my emotional reaction to the infrastructure of Spinalonga, to the fact that they lived in little houses, that they had um, bookshelves. You could see all this just from looking in the windows. There were still some curtains there. There was a cafe neon, bakery. You could see this big old, and still can, the big old furnos, and churches and so on. And I thought these people, they weren't just in hospital, which is what I'd imagined the patients would be, kind of lying in beds in
Mm-hmm.
bandages. They were, many of them, going about quite an ordinary life, which nobody had, told me because we didn't have a guide. I could just see that's how it was. Um, so I made a decision with that novel that the only thing I could do was either learn to read Greek, to research it, because the only things written about it were in Greek, um, and talk to anyone who knew the patients, most of whom were very elderly and only spoke Greek, or I would just imagine in a more classic novelistic way, just literally use my imagination, apart from the leprosy itself, which, I could research because I could find that out about that in English. So I made the decision that I would have my imaginary characters, but using the timeline of what actually happened with the development of the medicine, and therefore the moment when they're all free to go. So those were my kind of key dates. I could imagine when the Germans and Italians were occupying Crete, that would be one aspect, what it was like then to be on Spinalonga. And then the dates of the coming of the cure, or certainly the false hopes with the cure, which definitely happened, then the actual cure, and then the stigma that still attaches to them. So some actual facts, which are provided by factual dates and history, and then in terms of characters, all very much, as I kind of hoped. I mean, the names for that, most of the characters, I found in telephone books because I didn't really even know any Cretan names. So I borrowed the telephone directory from the cafe, which is opposite in Plaka, opposite Spinalonga. And I ended up renting a room from the person who ran the cafe to stay a while, just to feel what the atmosphere was like. And I remember them saying, "Can I borrow your phone book?" So I sat there with this huge fat book, and I looked up the section where they had most names, like the equivalent of Smith or Papadopoulos, but in Crete, for me, it seemed like everyone was called Petrakis. So that's why the Petrakis family is Petrakis. And then I knew that everyone was called Maria, and
Yes.
Manoli was very popular, and then there were Yorgos. So it was quite, in a way, it was quite naively done. Um, and that's, how the book came about. But it
So,
was
so
done with a lot of feeling.
yes, so the island was the reason for you to learn Greek as well, from what I gathered.
Yes, it was. I mean,
So
I,
you
I
can
didn't
do.
have time while I was writing, but as soon as I'd finished writing, um, I realized how useful it would be and would have been.
Mhm.
So I started my Greek lessons. Yeah,
And then you
that's right.
have your latest book as well, The Figurine, which explores the theme of homeland and deals with issue of stolen antiquities. So what motivated you to write this story?
Gosh, well, that again, each book is a bit of a departure. And that one was, I became interested really for the first time in my life in a deeper way in archaeology, because it is, after all, a very significant part of
Mm.
Greek culture, coming back to what we said at the beginning. Um, and I was taken on an excavation by a professor of archaeology from Cambridge University, who very kindly said, come and see how we do it and what we're finding, and which is lovely, very, very kind of him. So I went over to an island called Keros, which is off Koufonisi, which is off Naxos. So it was quite a journey, and spent a couple of days there with the archaeologists. And one of the first things that the professor told me, even when we were going across on the boat to the little island, he pointed out an area or right on the shore, and he said, um, "That's the area that on my first visit here, which was back in the 60s. He'd been running this excavation for 40 or 50 years. He said I could see that it had been looted, even that first visit. So I knew that people who'd been there before the archaeologists, and they had dug things up, and then they'd smuggled them and then sold them. So for him, that meant that it was like being given a jigsaw, but a lot of the pieces were missing. And it meant that they could never really conclusively understand the role, the things about them, how they were made and why they were made, because so many of them had already been stolen. So I thought that really interested me. That kind of sparked the idea of writing a novel about it, because it's sort of, in a way, it's a crime story. Strangely, I mean, it's also about the protagonist's kind of understanding of her connection with the country, which sort of is very much dovetailed, but into that story of what stealing things from the past does to the overall picture, and the overall story of who we are. And it's a very serious crime, in a way, against humanity, to just nick your heritage from another
Exactly.
country. And I know, that's something that I feel very strongly about, vis-a-vis, obviously, the Elgin, so called by many people, but I call them the Parthenon sculptures, because it's an outrage that half of those were stolen, and it's a big shame on Britain and the British Museum that they don't just come clean and say, no, we need to reunite them. So in a way, those were the Parthenon sculptures, are the sort of the one of the biggest examples that any of us can think, physically the biggest. They are
Mm.
monumental. But such thefts have happened all the way down to, even small things, but even small things have a value in the overall picture.
Of course.
So yeah, so it was a book, like all of the books I've written with, real passion and, to some extent, anger. I
You
don't,
expressed yourself.
yeah, I don't always feel, or sometimes somebody will say, what's the message of this book? And that sounds like something very didactic, a message. And I don't have a message in any of my books. I sort of explore something that
Yes.
I'm really interested in, but it has allowed me. It's when I suppose when I talk about the book, at events or talks or whatever. Obviously, then I give a message because, and I think I have managed quite successfully to convert people to the cause that
Yes,
that they should be reunited with um,
the homeland.
those
Yeah,
with their homeland and where they
exactly. It's
should
like a
be.
human being,
Yes, I
has to be
feel
where.
but also it's when I look at the horse's head in the British Museum, because I quite often go there for different events or just to remind myself how um, unfair it is. And it's the horse, it's particularly the horse's head um, that they have in the British Museum that just he looks so sad. It's really extraordinary. It's the horse that usually I want to kind of
Oh,
grab and put on a plane because he's got a real pathos because he shouldn't be down there near the ground. He's meant to be up. And yeah, so it is like a human being. It's certainly like flesh and blood
yes.
for me. It's like, stealing someone's half of, say somebody had twins and one of them gets kidnapped. I mean, that's even worse. The worst thing you can think of, isn't it?
Let's
And in
hope
a
that
way,
one
it's
day
like
they
that.
will find, they will be
They
bad.
will,
Yes,
Vasula.
and perhaps the British Museum would like to give a good example. You see, who knows?
Oh, it would be
Because good
nice. It would be
example,
nice. Yes.
it's a good gesture. Now, turning to more personal reflections, what captivates you most about Greece? And conversely, what disappoints or troubles you in a way similar to George Seferis reflected on his own complex relationship with his homeland?
Mm, gosh, there's always um, something to be perplexed about in Greece. You can't. I'm not naive. And I spend a lot of time there, and I have a lot of friends there, and I listen a lot to what they say. I think sometimes gosh, I mean, there are things happening in the UK that are to do with people not being open and clean. But I think that the cause, if there is a cause that I feel, again, something that really touches my heart in Greece at the moment is the Tempe train
Mm,
disaster.
yes.
And last Friday morning, because I was in Athens till Friday evening, I went to Syntagma Square. I usually do just to, look at the names. I always feel that somehow it's remembering, it's a memorial, but also it's a very um, active memorial because nobody is going to forget this. And um, there's a man there at the moment, one of the fathers, sitting there on hunger strike. And it is so incredibly, I mean, I did walk away and just sob once I'd talked to him. Um, because it was, I have children, who are in their, early 30s, but all of these were mostly students, weren't they? And this lovely man's son was sitting there, and he had a photograph of his dead son right by him, and of course, he looked very like his father. And this is a father who wants to have his son's remains forensically examined because he believes that he was one of the victims of that sort of second thing, the fire, the chemicals,
Mm,
and so on. And I just cannot understand how anyone can deny a parent the
the
truth,
truth, yes.
the truth. So I think sometimes with Greece, truth is much better out than hidden away, because people, particularly in that situation, those parents will never give up, and I know I would never give up. I would, do anything to have the truth, because if there was a crime, I think they deserve to, they will never be able to mourn their children properly if there's
Yes.
secrecy over what happened. So I sometimes wonder what's wrong with the truth. I think let the truth come out
Yes. You
now.
cannot
Don't
put
torture these
closure.
people.
Yes. If you don't
No.
know the
So
truth.
that's something I feel is an unnecessary sort of open wound for people. And in a way, all this other, the corruption stuff around all the goats that didn't exist and all of that, that involved the people as
Mhm.
well. That's not, you can't just say the politicians were claiming they had goats. It's these farmers in Crete, or not even farmers. So, that's the ordinary people as well, in joining in some kind of
Yes.
corruption. But with Tempe, they were totally innocent victims, and the parents are now victims as well, because they're being denied a truth.
The
And
truth,
I
which is
and I find
crucial.
that,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh,
So
put in
Greece
a
isn't
closure.
perfect, but
Yes.
it could be more perfect if they um just, rather than thinking people are just going to shut up about something eventually,
Mm.
why not let people have truth and clarity? I That's something that, I'm
We
not
need more people like
I
you, Victoria. We need more people like
well,
you.
no, but I think the parents
Yes.
should be
Yes.
enough. I mean, I always admire people who become politicians. I'm not somebody who just says, "Oh, politicians, they're all terrible people." All of them could have a much easier life if they were accountants, lawyers, bankers, all of them.
Mm.
But they choose that the choice of someone to become a politician, does involve personal sacrifice. I
Yes.
believe it does. They want to make the world a better place according to their belief
Beliefs.
system.
Yes.
Yeah, surely. If they're whether they're left or right, they want to contribute something to society.
Sure.
So
Mm.
I'm not just like somebody who condemn. I think, wow, I admire you for wanting to get up every morning with a whole list of problems that you'll never get to the bottom of. I mean, what a nightmare job. Um,
And
but occasionally they,
responsibility for
yeah,
big decisions.
responsibility.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're always going to be criticized. You're always going to have kind of, enemies and critics and so on. So I'm, but
Yes.
occasionally there's something I think, why don't you just do the right thing? Absolutely do the
Mhm.
right thing, because it's very clear
Sure.
what that is.
Sure.
And then take the responsibility.
Thank you.
Mm.
And finally, looking ahead, Victoria, do you have any new projects or works in progress that you would like to share with us?
I'm nearly towards the end of writing a new novel, but it doesn't have a title yet, but it is set in Greece. So,
Oh, we are looking
nothing,
forward
no,
to read it. Please do let us know and we can have another
I
chat.
will. I haven't, I haven't left Greece, that's for sure.
Ah, that's excellent news. Thank you so much, Victoria, for joining
It's
me
a
today
pleasure.
and sharing your insights, stories, and reflections on Greek culture and history. And to our listeners, if you haven't yet, be sure to check out Victoria Hislop's books, including The Island and The Figurine. Thank you for listening to Hellenic Voice. I'm Vasula, and I look forward to the next episode.
Thank you, Vasula. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Hellenic Voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please support us by sharing it, leaving your comments, and following us on social media so we can continue this journey through Greek culture together. Until the next episode, the voice of Hellenism continues.